We're doing a survey of 1st and 2nd Samuel. nativemi.org, threefeathersministry.com, where you'll be able to locate the Bible studies as well as Right Now Media. If you go to nativemi.org, go to the ministry page, look up Right Now Media, you'll see a link that you can utilize to sign on as part of my ministry. So you can have access to all 39 books of the Old Testament for your native church or yourself, learning the Word of God. Thank you, Dr. Rich Costanza, for allowing this. Now the title is 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's originally one book, main figure Samuel, and so it was given to both books as they made chapters and verses. The human author of the book is not stated. Samuel may have written the first part of the books himself. So 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Kings were all one book within themselves, and they subdivided. Now they're part of the historical books: Ruth, Esther, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. Did you realize Nehemiah is actually the last historical book in the Bible, whereas Malachi is the last prophetic book in the Bible? All the other books are prophets that dealt with the sins of the nation. First Samuel deals with the judge and prophets, then Saul and David's life, and then faith demonstrated facing Goliath. And it transitions Israel from a theocracy to a time of a monarchy where a king will rule. So here, choices and decisions have to be made. Who will we serve? Now, the date of writing is written during the division, after the division of Israel into the two kingdoms, which took place 90-30 BC. 1 Samuel 27:6, verse 6 makes reference to Judah, the southern kingdom, as a distinct identity from Israel and the northern kingdom. Now, it continues the history of Israel from the time of Judges, where it ended, and covers the time of the birth of Samuel to the death of Saul. 2 Samuel deals with David's reign for 40 years. Now, David would begin about 1010 BC and would end at 970 BC. Now, there's significant people in 1st, 2nd Samuel. Eli, a priest and judge who led the Israelites for 40 years. Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Samuel. Saul, the first king of Israel. Jonathan, Saul's son. David, the second king of Israel. Bathsheba, the woman who David would commit adultery with. Nathan, a prophet used to rebuke David for his sin. Absalom, David's son who tried to take the kingdom from his father. The key word in the book of 1 Samuel is transition. Key verse in the books: and Samuel said, "Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." Chapter 15, verse 22. Section 8, a summary of the content. The content is built around the lives of the leaders of Israel. 1. Eli and Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 1-7. Samuel and Saul, chapters 8-15. Saul and David, 16-31. The book of 2 Samuel continues the account of the life of David, where 1 Samuel concludes. The content of the book can be divided into 3 sections. 1. The triumphs of David, 2 Samuel 1-10. The transgressions of David, 2 Samuel chapter 11. The troubles of David, 2 Samuel chapters 12-24. Now, significant events. 1 Samuel chapters 1-7 involve the leadership of Eli and Samuel. In chapter 1, a barren woman named Hannah ask God for a son. Now her husband's other wife is mocking her. And she promises, I'll give you a son. Samuel sees her and says, are you drunk? No, I'm praying for a son. And he prayed for her. God gave her a son. Chapter 2, Hophni and Phinehas, the wicked sons of the priests of Eli, had used their position as priests to gain from the offerings and sacrifices brought to the Lord. Samuel would end up helping Eli as an elderly priest in the tabernacle. God would call Samuel in the night as a child 4 times. Samuel, he'd go and speak to Eli. That wasn't me. Samuel. And Eli said, that wasn't me. He perceived after the 3rd time that God was, or 2nd time that God was speaking to him. He said, speak, Lord. And so when he laid down, this time God spoke, Samuel. Samuel twice. So 4 times God had called his name. And in his trial, he gave a word of judgment that Eli would be disciplined in his sons for failure to restrain them. And they in turn would be put to death. The Israelites go to battle against the Philistines and call for the Ark of the Covenant to be brought to the battle site. The Philistines kill another 26,000 people of Israel, however, including Eli's son Hophni and Phinehas, and capture the ark. Upon hearing the news, Eli, who was overweight, falls backward off his chair, breaks his neck, and dies after leading Israel for 40 years. Eli's daughter-in-law, who's pregnant, hears the news of the death of her husband and father-in-law and goes into labor. She gives birth to a son named Ichabod, meaning no glory, but she dies in childbirth. Her final recorded word summarizes the situation. Ichabod, the glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 22. Now in chapter 5, the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant to Ashdod, one of the 5 major Philistine cities. They put it in their temple next to the idol of their false god Dagon. The next morning, they discover Dagon has fallen on his face in front of the ark. They put him back up in his place, but the next day they find him on his face again, with his head and hands broken off. As a result, the Philistines moved the Ark of the Covenant to the city of Gath and Ekron, where similar consequences occur. 1 Samuel chapter 6. After 7 months, the Philistines decide to send the ark back to Israel. Some people look into the ark and God strikes them dead. 1 Samuel chapter 7. The Ark of the Covenant is taken to the city of Corah, where for 20 years until 2 Samuel 6:3, it would be kept in relative obscurity in the house of a man named Abinadab. 1 Samuel 8. As Samuel grows old, he appoints his son Joel and Abijah to serve as judges. But they accept bribes and do not rule with justice. As a result, the elders of Israel asked Samuel to make us a king to judge us like all the other nations. 1 Samuel 8:5. Think that will solve their leadership problems. Samuel is displeased, but God tells him, they have not rejected you, they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Chapter 8, verse 7. In chapter 9, God tells Samuel that Saul, a choice young man from the tribe of Benjamin, who is taller than all the other Israelites, is to be the first king of Israel. Now 1 Samuel chapter 10. Samuel appoints Saul privately as king of Israel. Samuel brings all the tribes of Israel together to present Saul to them. But Saul hides and has to be brought out to the gathering. In chapter 11, all the people gather at Gilgal and confirm Saul as their king. Chapter 12, Samuel delivers a farewell address in which he recounts the history of Israel and rebukes the people for rejecting God and asking for a king. Moving along in chapter 13, Saul waits for 7 days in the city of Gilgal, then grows impatient, waiting for Samuel to come and make the offerings he had promised to make. Saul offers the sacrifices himself. Samuel arrives and rebukes Saul. Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God. Thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought him a man after his own heart. And then in chapter 14, Saul and his son Jonathan and a group of soldiers defeat the Philistines. 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel tells Saul to totally destroy the Amalekites as punishment for the history of hostility toward Israel. See Exodus 17 verses 8 to 13, Numbers 14:43, Deuteronomy 25. Saul leads the slaughter of the Amalekites, but spares the king Agag and the best of the sheep and cattle. Samuel confronts Saul about this disobedience, and Saul claims he wanted to sacrifice the animals to the Lord. Samuel rebukes Saul. To obey is better than sacrifice. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. 1 Samuel chapter 15, 22 and 23. 1 Samuel, the later reign of Saul, and the life of David, chapter 16 to 31. In chapter 16, God tells Samuel to go to the household of Jesse in Bethlehem. For one of Jesse's sons will be the next king of Israel. God says no to the first son, then approves the youngest David. Saul sends for David, who plays his harp and soothes Saul, and becomes Saul's armor-bearer. 1 Samuel chapter 17, Goliath, the giant Philistine, mocks God and challenges the Israelites for 40 days. All the soldiers, including King Saul, cower in fear. David falls in tears to fight Goliath. David runs to meet Goliath. I come to thee in the name of the Lord my God. How dare you defy his armies? And so big Goliath, the giant, says, what am I come to fight, a dog? He picks up the stones, uses a slingshot, hits him in the forehead, and there he goes over. He grabs Goliath's sword, cuts his head off, and the army of the Philistines begin to run, and the Israeli soldiers begin to chase them. Then in chapter 18, Saul's son Jonathan becomes David's close friend. Saul becomes jealous of David during a procession celebrating the victory over the Philistines. It was common in that day for a groom to pay a price to the father of the bride. Genesis 34, Exodus 22. Saul sets the price to marry Michal at 100 Philistines, hoping they would kill David for him. Instead, David kills 200 Philistines, and Saul allows Michal to marry David. Chapter 20. Jonathan warns David of his father's plot to kill him. David flees and is on the run for 10 years. In chapter 21, David flees to the city of Nob, where he is given the sword that previously belonged to Goliath. Chapter 22. David hides in a cave at Adullam, and about 400 men join him there. And in chapter 23, David and his men, now 600, take refuge in the hills near the city of Ziph. They're called David's mighty men of valor. In chapter 24, Saul and 3,000 of his men resume the pursuit of David. Saul enters a cave, not knowing that David and his men are hiding in it. David's men urges him to kill Saul. But instead David sneaks up on notice and cuts off a piece of Saul's robe. David informs him that his life had been spared, showing Saul the piece of his robe opposite the cave on another hill. Saul declares to David, "Thou art more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded you evil. I know well that you shall surely be king." 1 Samuel 24, verse 17 and 20. In chapter 25, Samuel dies. David travels to the wilderness of Paran, where he asks a wealthy man named Nabal for provisions for his men. He says no. However, Nabal's wife quickly prepares a feast and takes it to David and his men without telling her husband. Now, David had told Nabal, "I've been sitting on these hills with my men protecting your sheep, and you won't give me one lousy sheep?" David prepares to kill him. David accepts the food and praises God for Abigail's wisdom in averting needless bloodshed. Nabal's heart fails him and he dies 10 days later. When David hears that Nabal is dead, he takes Abigail as his wife. Now in chapter 26, David flees to the wilderness near the city of Ziph. Some residents of Ziph tell Saul where David is. And the king takes his 3,000 men and heads in that direction. As Saul sleeps during the night, David sneaks up and takes Saul's spear and water jug, once again sparing the king's life. Now in chapter 27, David goes to live in the Philistine territory for 16 months, thinking that one day Saul might kill him. Achish, the Philistine king of Gath, gives David the city of Zildag to live in. And in chapter 28, Saul disguises himself and goes to see a witch at night, asking her to bring back Samuel from the dead in order that he might give Saul advice. Here, he turns from the living God and he turns to Satan for information. The dead are the dead. And demons imitate the dead. In the Bible, they're called familiar spirits in the Old Testament. He goes to consult the witch. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 29, as the Philistines gather for battle against Israel, David and his men are marching at the rear of the Philistine army. But some of the Philistine commanders are uneasy with that arrangement. They still remember it was David who had killed so many Philistines, including their champion Goliath. And so David and his men are required to return home. And in chapter 30, returning to the home, to Ziklag, David discovers in his absence that the city had been invaded by a group of Amalekites who had burned the city, taking captive the women, including the wives of David and his men and children. David and his men recover everything and everyone that Amalekites had taken. And this is when his men turn on him. And the Bible says that he took refuge in the name and presence of the Lord. 1 Samuel chapter 31. The Philistines fight against Israel, killing 3 of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, and wounding Saul critically. Rather than suffering the shame of being killed by the Philistines, Saul falls on his own sword and dies, a death of humiliation and chastisement by God. Here's a chart, interesting facts about Samuel, that I encourage you to pause the video or go to the PowerPoint slides where you can just watch them paused. Now, we're looking at 2 Samuel. Beginning with the reign of David, establishes his capital in Jerusalem, expands his border. Then the sin of David with Bathsheba. Third, the covenant made with David, an everlasting covenant, promising the future kingdom. And then justice. David administers justice. In 2 Samuel, the triumphs of David, chapters 1 through chapter 10. In chapter 1, a messenger brings news of the death of Saul and claims to have killed Saul, expecting David to reward him. David, not knowing how Saul really died, orders the man to be put to death for killing the Lord's anointed king. Chapter 2. The men of the tribe of Judah, David's own tribe, anoint him king. Abner, the cousin of Saul and commander of Saul's army, who had managed to escape the Philistines, took Ishbosheth, Saul's remaining son, and sets him forth as king. In chapter 3, Abner tries to strengthen his own position by going to David and saying, "Make thy leg with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you, to bring about all Israel unto you." David makes the covenant with Abner. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 4. The son of Jonathan, a crippled young man named Mephibosheth, is mentioned for the first time. Two men named Baanah and Rechab kill Ishbosheth, Saul's son, who was rivaling David for the throne. As he's taking a noonday rest, cut off his head and bring it to David. David orders the two men to be executed. Now 2 Samuel chapter 5. All the tribes of Israel acknowledge David as king, conquering the city of Jerusalem, also known as Zion, and subsequently the city of David, and establishes it as his capital. And so Jerusalem comes into history. In chapter 6, David calls for the Ark of the Covenant to be brought to Jerusalem with the grand procession. The Ark of the Covenant had been stored 20 years in a relative obscurity and is transported on a cart. However, rather than on poles carried by the priests as God had commanded, Exodus 25, Numbers chapter 4, the oxen pulling the cart stumble, and a man named Uzzah touches the Ark of the Covenant to prevent it from falling. God kills Uzzah because the law, Numbers 4, strictly prohibits any Israelite from touching the Ark of the Covenant. In chapter 7, David realized how inappropriate it is for him to have a nice house while the Ark of the Covenant is kept in the tent. He wants to build a more appropriate place for the Ark of the Covenant, a temple. In chapter 9, Ziba, a former servant of Saul, informs David that there is a crippled son of Jonathan named Mephibosheth. David shows kindness to him for Jonathan's sake. Now 2 Samuel, the transgression of David, chapter 11. David would end up on his rooftop looking at a woman bathing herself naked and calls for Bathsheba to come over. He ends up seducing her, sleeping with her. She had a husband, Uriah. When David found out that Bathsheba, like most men having an affair, find out, "I'm pregnant." Oh, doesn't that thrill him? He calls Uriah home from the battlefield and gets Uriah drunk, hoping that Uriah would go home and sleep with Bathsheba, so he'd think it was his kid. Uriah doesn't go home, however. He thinks it's dishonorable for his men that he fought alongside for him to go home and be with his wife, or to get drunk, so he lies out there. David ends up sending him to battle, orders Uriah stationed where the fighting is fiercest, and orders the rest of the army to be pulled back from him, so he is killed. Upon learning of Uriah's death, David takes Bathsheba as his wife. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now, the trouble of David, chapters 12 to 24. His life would change. He'd reap what he would sow. Fortunately for him, God sent a prophet Nathan to rebuke David about his sin. He gave him a parable about a man having one little lamb, another herder having a whole flock of sheep. And this one man goes ahead and takes this man's little lamb, who he thought was as a daughter, and kills it to eat it. He says, "That man shall surely die." Nathan the prophet, with his bony finger, points at him and says, "Thou art the man." David, now confronted with his sin, knowing that God knows, he sent a man of God, has two options: kill the prophet or acknowledge God's conviction and confess his sin. And so he is brought to a place of repentance, confessing that sin and asking God to forgive him. Psalms chapter 51 is a result showing the prayer that he would pray out to God. Part of the judgment, God told him he'd be taking the baby. David going to pray, crying out to God, "I messed up my life. Forgive me, please spare the child." When they come to David and let him know that the baby is gone, he rises up, no longer crying, and they ask, "Why aren't you crying?" And he says, "My baby cannot come to me, but I can go to my baby." And that's the hope, that we're going to be with our children. And sometimes we mess up in life, where a child is taken. Oh, I read something about a horrific accident. Somebody asking for prayer, mother running over her own child. Struggling right now to live with that. But God's a God of grace and mercy, as he dealt with David and Bathsheba. They'd have another baby. His name would be Solomon. Now in chapter 13, David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. 2 years later, Absalom, another of David's son and full of brother of Tamar, has his servants kill Amnon. Absalom flees and stays away for 3 years, fearing his father David's wrath. In chapter 14, David agrees to allow Absalom to return, and Absalom comes back to Jerusalem. In chapter 15, Absalom steals the hearts of the Israelites in an effort to take the throne from his father David. Chapter 18. David commands the leaders of the three groups not to harm Absalom. While in battle, Absalom flees on a mule, but his hair gets caught in the branches of a tree and he is left hanging in midair. Joab is told where Absalom is, and he and 10 other men kill Absalom while he's hanging in the tree in direct disobedience to David's order. See 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 3. In chapter 19, David is able to return to Jerusalem, gradually assumes the leadership as king of Israel again. 2 Samuel chapter 22, David sings a song of praise to God for his deliverance from his enemies. And in chapter 23, There's a list of 37 of David's warriors called the Mighty Men, including a description of the achievement of 5 of them. Now, one of the things that had helped them succeed was a man came to him and he says, so-and-so betrayed you and he went with your son. I'm going to stay behind and I'm going to interfere with his wisdom and what he says to your son. So that's been my prayer over time, that God would reveal those that do evil against leaders and upset the counsel of the ungodly that get them in rebellion, a rebellious spirit. In 24, David counts the fighting men of Israel, well over 1 million, apparently over pride over the size of the empire he had built. 1 Chronicles 21:1 says, Satan provoked David to number Israel. God is displeased and gives David 3 options as a consequence of his sins. 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from enemies, or 3 days of plague. David acknowledges his sin and accepts the plague. And 70,000 people of Israel are killed. The threshing floor was a hard surface where bundles of grain were spread and trampled by oxen to separate the good grain from the chaff. David buys one to build an altar to the Lord, and the plague stops. That threshing floor would later become the site where Solomon would build a magnificent temple, found in 1 Chronicles 22 and 2 Chronicles chapter 3. Now here's a list of the prophets ministering to the northern kingdom: Amos, Hosea; to Nineveh, Jonah, Nathan. And you can see the various groups of prophets. In 2 Samuel, it said, the word of the Lord came to the prophet. Now, interesting facts. You may want to pause to look at the chart. Here's a brief chronology of the Bible to see where we're at, and the 10 time periods that are covered from creation: Adam, Eden, Cain and Abel, Noah, the flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, wilderness, Joshua, Judges, Saul, David, and Solomon is where we're at. Please take your camera phone and you can do homework for both 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. These are QR codes. And then also we have a complete list of all of the homework videos. They're about 7 minutes to 9 minutes on average for each one of the 39 books of the Old Testament. Now, all the resources for a native study, whether you're an individual, a church, home Bible study, or Bible school. The teacher's notes, student notes written by Dr. Rich Constanza, allowed to be used for native ministry. Also, PowerPoints that God blessed me to allow to create, as well as videos that are made for each one of these PowerPoint presentations. And then the class video will also be provided. These and other resources are given to you so that you could not only study and understand it as a survey, but deep dive. Make a note that in the PowerPoints, if you look at the bottom in the notes, oftentimes they're detailed Bible studies of Bible characters. Robert DeCorah, nativemi.org, robertdecorah@gmail.com. So God bless you.